Welcome to Stifel's Sightlines podcast, focusing each week on a topic or two important to investors. Well, greetings and welcome to the Sightlines podcast. This is Michael O'Keefe, Stifel's Chief Investment Officer. Every once in a while we get a question coming in from clients, honestly, that sort of trigger the topic we want to get into, and that's the case this week. We've gotten a few queries about really the dollar. The U.S. dollar is the world's reserve currency. So a good opportunity to take a step back and have a look at that topic, right? So obviously since World War II and all the kind of rebuilding and things that were done in the wake of that war, the U.S. dollar has really enjoyed a position as the world's reserve currency. And yet we know, and we'll get into the details here, that other countries, especially China, are sort of executing on strategy to try to unseat that. But let's get into kind of where we are today. So the dollar remains the most widely used currency and sort of operates as a reserve well, in the sense that, when we look at just some data, when we look at foreign exchange transactions, the dollar is involved in 88% of those. When we look at foreign exchange reserves, the dollar is involved in 59%. And another example would be foreign currency debt issuance done in dollars, almost 70%. And just to give you a sense for the Chinese yuan, essentially those three categories, so FX transactions 7%, reserves 2.6%, debt issuance 2.2%. So the yuan specifically has a long way to go. And really, it's the euro that's sort of a fairly distant second when it comes to the dollar. In any event, so what's been stirring things up a little bit? Well, I think there's sort of two topics. One would be to look at how the G7, so Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the UK, and the US, the G7 basically have imposed many more financial sanctions since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And so in response, you can almost think of it as Russia, sort of with the support of China. It's really the BRICS countries. So in this case, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa are sort of coordinating and trying to figure out ways to sort of transact in currencies beyond the dollar. And so they've been promoting that activity. And with that, or along with that, China basically has an alternative payment system that it's been trying to expand the use of with its trading partners to sort of increase the international adoption of the yuan. Now, I would say the other sort of framing here then is to say, well, gee, if it's still dollar and the yuan, China wanting the yuan to kind of come into some use and eventually kind of be considered at least a reserve currency, what are the potentials for that? So there are some essentially focused on that, the idea that shift is going to happen imminently. And it's essentially based upon that alternative payment system. It's based upon the yuan being used more actively with energy transactions. And then also the potential for a central bank digital currency. That topic overall is sort of one that has people focused, but especially to the degree that China actually is the creator of such a currency, will that sort of create the opportunity for China to kind of come into the system, the yuan really, or something controlled by China. And so that's something that's in focus. In any event, most downplay this as an imminent, quote unquote, risk or threat, citing things like, the current dominance of the U.S. when it comes to global transactions, et cetera, like we've talked about, but also China just having a propensity, of course, to control the flows of money into and out of their country. So the idea of things not freeing freely and China being able to kind of control that at any moment in time, of course, has people kind of spooked. Now, with regard to the U.S., of course, we have to be mindful of the risks here. And so, long story short, basically we watch things like the fiscal transition we've talked about, higher rates, deficit spending, a buildup of debt. There are things that are sort of headwinds that are going to incrementally sort of soften the confidence in the U.S. But right now, these things are really incremental. And so we don't see that as imminent. In any event, one thing I'll point out is there's a nonpartisan think tank in D.C. called the Atlantic Council. And one of the things that this group does is to it's really a website called the Dollar Dominance Monitor that's basically tracking how the dollar is being used, but also these sort of tactical and strategic moves by China and a little bit others, kind of how that's all unfolding. So as a resource, I would certainly encourage checking out the Dollar Dominance Monitor at the Atlantic Council in D.C. on their website. In any event, other things that we're going to watch, of course, are, I would just say more broadly, geopolitical developments, this sort of tension between G7 and BRICS, for example, is something we have to keep an eye on. That idea of innovation, so we've talked a lot about, this year, artificial intelligence and the idea of sort of technology accelerating change. Well, of course, that can happen here. So we're talking monitoring of financial infrastructure, and again, the central bank, digital currency developments, things like that. And then finally, I would just say more generally, global economic and policy trends that adjust confidence in the U.S. So it could be patterns that increase confidence and trust, or it could be patterns that sort of erode that. But it's also vice versa. Like we want to keep an eye on China through the same lens. And so again, it's just a pattern that we'll watch over time. But just to sort of wrap it, we're not overly concerned in the near to almost medium term about the dollar's sort of role as if not the reserve currency around the globe. But we have to be mindful of these patterns and keep an eye on things. So anyway, that's what we wanted to cover in this episode. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll catch you on the next one. Thanks again for listening to Stifel's Sightlines. Be sure to subscribe wherever you're listening to automatically receive each week's podcast in your feed.